All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking what is honestly a pretty severe warning about the Ukraine war, and it's coming from an unlikely source, Viktor Bout. We're going to look at this fascinating analysis that pulls together some absolute historical heavyweights to dissect how, exactly, limited conflicts can just spiral completely out of control. It's basically a roadmap of the anatomy of escalation. We're jumping straight into the deep end here with a really profound question that sets the stakes for this whole crisis. What if Europe is already inside the war, before its people even realize it? I mean, it totally challenges our basic assumption that war is like a light switch, right? We tend to think it's either off or it's on. But what if it's actually more like a dimmer switch, and the lights are already glaring? The legendary strategist George Kennan pointed out that wars just don't go global in an afternoon. That's not how it works. They slowly build up through this progression of choices that, at the time, seemed totally limited. First, there's a high-level decision. Then maybe a simple weapons shipment. Next thing you know, a drone factory is set up, or deep intelligence is being shared. And eventually you hit step 4. The map changes permanently. What started out as just assistance morphs into active participation, way before the public even grasps the shift. Okay, Section 1, the blurry line of war. Now, Henry Kissinger had this brilliant observation. He said that nations in conflict often use completely different dictionaries to describe the exact same actions. For example, the Western narrative frames sending weapons purely as assistance and deterrence, right? But the Russian narrative looks at those exact same shipments and sees intervention and encirclement. Both sides feel absolutely defensive, which ends up creating some incredibly offensive realities. And Viktor Bout argues in this analysis, quite impartially actually, that specific material factors literally erase the legal language of neutrality. We're talking about things like deep logistics, real-time intelligence sharing, massive weapons production, and integrated communication networks. These aren't just minor details. These material actions turn suppliers into direct battlefield targets. Because let's face it, great powers don't just read the legal fine print. They look at the reality on the battlefield. Moving on to Section 2. Drones and the new battlefield. Historian Yuval Noah Harari brings up a really chilling warning here. He points out that this new tech completely removes the physical distance that, historically, protected civilians from the terrors of war. He calls it the merger of surveillance and violence. Think about it. A drone isn't just a flying bomb anymore. It's a massive data collection system. When the eye that's watching you is literally the exact same weapon that can strike you, that border between a designated battlefield and everyday civilian life, it essentially vanishes. Distance is no longer a shield. But then, countering that perspective, you have defense tech entrepreneur Palmer Luckey, who argues that, well, we can't exactly put the genie back in the bottle. Yes, drones create immense danger, but since we literally cannot uninvent them, pretending they don't exist isn't a strategy. The answer has to be robust defense systems and strict human command responsibility. The tech creates the threat for sure, but human oversight and better technology have to be the tools we use to reduce it. So the reality is that cheap, maybe couple $100 machines can now destroy multi-million-dollar targets. That turns war into this permanent, hyper-fast innovation race where ground-level rapid learning completely beats out traditional slow military procurement. But the absolute most terrifying risk, it's that when war moves faster than human judgment, we risk surrendering our conscience to the algorithms mapping the battlefield. We're essentially dissolving human moral responsibility into lines of code. Which brings us to Section 3, the danger of holy war. Theologian Reinhold Niebuhr perfectly, and somewhat terrifyingly, summarized this dynamic. He said, once war becomes holy, peace begins to look like sin. When a population truly believes they aren't just fighting over a piece of land, but for the very soul of their civilization, how do you even sit down at a negotiating table? When compromise literally feels like a betrayal of your faith, the conflict becomes nearly impossible to negotiate an end to. The source analysis points out that both sides view themselves as the ultimate defenders of civilization. And when a conflict gets tied to that deep orthodox identity and historical memory, the enemy is no longer just a political opponent. They become absolute evil. Suffering is suddenly rationalized as spiritual purification. Tragically, this pride, wearing religious clothing, makes nations willing to accept total, absolute ruin rather than agree to a diplomatic settlement. It just becomes a zero-sum game of the soul. All right, Section 4, losing control of escalation. Václav Havel's perspective shows us exactly how governments trap themselves in these cycles. First, a temporary measure somehow shifts into a permanent state of emergency. Second, supporting the foreign conflict becomes the ultimate domestic test of loyalty. Third, simply asking basic questions about the strategy or the cost, that gets labeled as disloyalty. And finally, ordinary citizens are conditioned to just become passive spectators of their own escalation. So this forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Do leaders create war, or does war just expose weak leadership? Are Western leaders truly managing this escalation with clear strategic goals, or are declining domestic politics, ideological traps, and sheer bureaucratic momentum actually managing them? It's an absolutely crucial distinction for anyone trying to figure out where this whole thing is heading. Finally, Section 5. Enemies to partners? History reminds us of something really important. The sheer, shared terror of global nuclear destruction actually forced mortal enemies back to the negotiating table during the Cold War. They had to build a manageable reality. Looking forward, as crazy as it sounds right now, moving past this current brinksmanship could theoretically lead to cooperation again, in space, in science, in energy. Because at the end of the day, survival is a shared interest that transcends any current rivalry. Former President Ronald Reagan really drove home the ultimate point here. He said, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. It is not weakness to fear such a war, it is sanity." Seeking peace, demanding diplomatic off-ramps, admitting the absolute terror of nuclear escalation, that isn't sentimental weakness. It's actually the ultimate form of political realism. So I'm going to leave you with this urgent, final thought from George Kennan's analysis. Can our leaders rediscover restraint before the machines of war just make the choice for them? The escalation ladder is fully built, and the momentum is pushing us upward. The real question we have to ask ourselves is, do we still have the judgment to step back down? Thanks so much for joining us on This Explainer, and we'll catch you in the next one.